This video is sponsored by Ground News. My friends, today I will do a summary of what happened in the last month on the 100-kilometer long Luhansk front. And we have every reason to assume that the party is just starting in this direction. Especially since Russian tank formations have already exploited multiple gaps in the Ukrainian line of defense. As of now, the bulk of the fighting is taking place in three sectors: Sinkivka, Kislivka, and Terny, and we'll go over each one of them one by one. This Telegram channel called Dnevnik Desantnika reported that the Ukrainian command is transferring a lot of reserves from the northern sector towards Avdiivka, thus exposing a lot of positions near Kupiansk. As Ukrainian elite mechanized formations are redeployed, of course the holes are plugged with mobilized personnel, and this poses a great threat to the Ukrainian army. Check out what Forbes wrote on February 3rd. Russia has massed 500 tanks for an attack on Kupiansk. And a couple days later, the Washington Post released this article. Frontline Ukrainian infantry units report acute shortage of soldiers. They interviewed a battalion commander called Alexander. He said, I quote, "Most likely, I think the front will collapse somewhere, as it did for the enemy in 2022 in the Kharkiv region." Wow, that's one of the most optimistic Ukrainian reports I've read in weeks. I mean, all over the front, mechanized columns of the 1st Tank Army are tearing through undermanned Ukrainian positions. Alright, bratan, Kupiansk is not really that strategic anyway. Actually, as a follow-up to that Washington Post article, the deputy commander of the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov, Maxim Zhorin, said the following in an interview.
Я вважаю, що на сьогоднішній день не можна їх розкривати. Нам постійно потрібні люди. Ось це треба зрозуміти. Не кількість не вирішить питання навіть 500 тисяч людей. Ну, ми що, 500 тисяч людей отримаємо і переможемо у війні? Ні, так же ж не буде.
Let's be honest, Ukraine has no other choice but to call hundreds of thousands of men to the front. Already now, the simple day-to-day attrition means that many Ukrainian replacements are lost simply by sitting in trenches. That's because whenever Russian troops faced a fortified bastion, they stop. Oh, they're still holding out. Что? Still's there. At this point, because the Russians are spreading out their assaults over a 100-kilometer front, it's very hard for the Ukraine command to detect these concentrations and to counterattack in a timely and decisive manner, especially with Ukrainian battalions that are at half strength. But don't worry, Stein's counterattack will solve everything. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukraine war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my videos have been targeted with limited or no ads, so make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. The fighting along the Luhansk border can be characterized by a continuation of small set-piece offensives instead of one big push. Each one of these regiments now have dedicated special assault detachments. From what I've noticed, it is every regiment's job to continuously test enemy positions for weak points by sending forward small squads of Storm Z units. The moment they find a gap, they quickly infiltrate it, and that's when the regiment commander pours in all the reserves he has directly available right into the breach. If all this is successful, that's when the army sends even more regiments to push the attack as far as they can, all the while holding the flanks and all the latest gains from Ukrainian counterattacks. Usually the time frame of such an offensive is 1 week, then they stop and they will attack somewhere else, thus paralyzing Ukrainian reserves that are always guessing for the next Russian move. So let's start with the biggest threat for Ukraine, the Battle of Sinkivka. As you can see on the map, the village is located 6 kilometers northeast of Kupiansk. If it falls, it's GG, well played. It's literally the last urban area before the outskirts of Kupiansk. For months, Ukraine has been fighting tooth and nail to maintain its presence in this forest. This is the perspective of a Ukrainian soldier stationed on that part of the front, with all the trees clearly limiting the visibility. Here are the three main units defending Sinkivka and its surroundings. The 2nd Battalion of the 30th Mechanized Brigade, the 1st Battalion of the 25th Airborne Brigade, and the 1st Battalion of the 95th Air Assault Brigade. Roughly 1,000 men at best. The way we can summarize the fighting in that sector is that there is this big forested area, the village of Sinkivka, and then flat open ground in between. Essentially, the Ukrainians are waiting in formation just like the Romans did in Gladiator. The barbarian hordes are the Russian Storm Zeds units, and the moment they leave the cover of the forest, they get hammered into oblivion. And lastly, the cavalrymen hacking them off are Ukrainian FPV drones. For months, Russian officers attempted these brute force frontal attacks one after the other, which got their troops wrecked. For example, in this video, you see 6 Russian destroyed armored vehicles. That's when a column of 4 new vehicles advances through the same area.
You are made of stupid.
And no surprise, all 4 of them are lost 50 meters away from the first batch, with around 20 riflemen and crews now stuck there in open terrain. I mean, to be fair, they tried to raise the morale of their troops with some karaoke event, but clearly that's not what their troops meant when they said they wanted a better performance. Apparently, in January, the Russian army replaced the 2 commanders of that part of the front, and surprise surprise, that's when things started moving again. The new men in charge thought that maybe it was best to capture the neighboring forest first and use it as a stepping stone to concentrate their forces to flank Sinkivka. So how do you conquer this entire forest? Well, in such terrain, you have no choice but to make heavy use of infantry. On the 21st of January, the Russians destroyed a Ukrainian tank 3.5 kilometers away from the contact line using a Lancet drone. And a couple of days later, another one was targeted in the same sector. Meanwhile, in this video from the 27th of January, we see a Ukrainian tank firing at point blank at some enemy troops at the forest edge. This would be geolocated right here on the map. In the next frame, we see another Ukrainian tank, perhaps the same one, firing at enemy troops. If we assume this is a T-72 with a length of 9.53 meters, and that 10 such tanks fit in the frame, we can assume the enemy was located roughly 100 meters away. These Ukrainian tank raids could mean that Russian assault detachments have been infiltrating the front line, and that they pushed much more than we think. The Ukrainian reports from the 28th mentioned that Russian troops launched multiple attacks against Sinkivka, but they failed. So you know the drill. Take a break, bombard everything, rinse and repeat. For example, on January 29th, Russian artillery targeted this Ukrainian fire team of 4 soldiers. This video from February 1st shows a Russian motorized mortar firing towards the village of Sinkivka from a distance of 1.6 kilometers. And there's also this FPV drone interrupting a resupply of ammunition for the defenders of the place. The next day, Ukrainian reports mentioned once again that Russian attacks in the sector have failed. And I'm starting to think that every time they mention this, it's not an actual attack necessarily, but it could simply be that they repulsed a recon mission. Now, according to Zodiac maps, by the 9th of February, the Russians managed to get a foothold inside the northern part of the village. And according to the latest news, they must have been pushed out, since a Russian assault detachment was still clearing Ukrainian outposts right here. Honestly, the situation is confusing, and it seems some Ukrainian soldiers are still edging right here in the forest. Meanwhile, a Russian squad was targeted by Ukrainian artillery right here. This could mean that the Russian plan is indeed to push further into the forest and bypass Sinkivka. So regarding today's topic, personally I've been using this app and website by Ground News for my research. They have a complete coverage of the Russo-Ukraine war from many different perspectives for a more accurate understanding of what is really going on. You can check them out at ground.news/historylegends. The link is in the description. For example, this story is about how Zelensky replaced Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army. You can read a quick summary of this based on more than 280 sources from around the world ground news found. Down below, I can see these articles categorized by the source's political leaning, left-wing, right-wing, with tabs highlighting its reliability and ownership for a comprehensive analysis on any bias that might influence its reporting. Then you can click on high factuality, and ground news filters the articles with the most truthful information for you. Look, seeing both sides of a war can be difficult, so it's critical to read different perspectives on each story to make sure you aren't being manipulated by propaganda. That is all made easier with ground news. So go to ground.news/historylegends to subscribe. You can get 30% off if you subscribe through my link, or try it for less than $1 this month. Now let's move 20 kilometers southeast of Sinkivka. By January 17th, the front line ran across the three villages of Ivanivske, Kislivka, and Kotlyarivka, and then it went south all along this railway line all the way until Novoselivske. Now a big part of this contact line was covered by the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade, aka 2nd or 3rd tier unit composed of conscripts. Unbeknown to them, the Russian army had secretly massed assault detachments in Volodymyrivka. All hell broke loose on the 18th of January, as Russian assault units attacked over a 6-kilometer front and pushed 2 kilometers inside enemy lines. The Ukrainian territorial defense units were overwhelmed and most of them fell back. The Russians captured this crossroad, and one of the key positions was Shuka, or the pike. This force line filled with machine gun nests, which they eventually calmed and secured. The Ukrainian command saw the danger and immediately tried to counterattack. This time, armored units of the 32nd Mechanized Brigade would lead the charge. Meanwhile, Ukrainian drone operators started harassing Russian troops that began occupying various trench networks. However, despite all the heavy equipment used during this counterattack, it failed. Here are 2 abandoned Leopard 2A4s and 1 YPR 765 armored personnel carrier. At the bottom right, you can even see another Leopard 2A4 left behind, with an M113 by its side. To make matters even worse, Lancets were raining, searching for the enemy along the entire line of contact. In a way, we can compare these FPV drones and Lancet to javelin throwers of ancient battles. Both sides made heavy use of these light infantrymen whose sole purpose was to harass and weaken enemy formations from afar. Now the first nightmare for Ukraine happened on the 20th of January, when Russian forces secured the village of Krokhmalny. I mean, village is really a stretch, because if we zoom in, there are only 3 houses. Here we have Russian soldiers planting the flag on a rooftop. And they also took this commemorative picture right in front of a house. We can't even know which house that is. Even if you have 0 knowledge in geolocation, you have a 1 in 3 chance to get it right. By the way, if you were curious, well, that's the house. Now, if we examine what they wrote on the flag, we learn that they're part of a storming unit of the 153rd Tank Regiment. Here the letters TP stand for Tankovy Polk, aka Tank Regiment. Now we know that the 153rd Tank Regiment is part of the 47th Division, which is itself part of the 1st Tank Army. And there are a lot more details we can learn. For example, these soldiers all wrote their combat nicknames on the flag. Sarmat, Knyaz, Ali, Shket, Scorpion. At that point, I think the Russian command faced 3 options. Number 1, push towards Tabaivka. Once again, a heavily urbanized area composed of 2 buildings, one of which being a cemetery. Charming. Number 2, attack right in the center and cross 4 kilometers in open terrain using their armored vehicles towards Pishane. Or option 3, advance across these 2 fields and storm Berestove. We can't believe the Russians tried to attack Berestove. If successful, this would have released all the troops from Novoselivske, causing a real dent across the Ukrainian front line. But the Ukrainians responded swiftly and repulsed all these Russian attacks. On top of that, we have to consider that the Russians had made gains further north, and Tabaivka was only 1,500 meters away from that crossroad they previously secured. The front in this sector froze for a week, most likely to resupply frontline units, bring reinforcements, and rotate out eroded assault detachments. During those days, in preparation for round 2 of their offensive, the Russians carried heavy shelling on Ukrainian positions. For example, here you can see the work of a 100mm 2A70 gun from a BMP-3 that can fire up to a range of 7 kilometers. Russian aviation also wanted to light up some fireworks. As you can see here, they hammered the Tabaivka sector with multiple FAB-500s on the 26th of January. Now, while all this was taking place, 5 kilometers to the north, the Russians attempted to storm Ivanivka. If successful, this would have put the villages of Kislivka and Kotlyarivka into a cauldron and essentially near encirclement. But once again, the Ukrainians counterattacked in strength. Here you can see an abandoned Polish-made T-72 east of the village of Ivanivka. The destruction was geolocated right here, meaning the tank must have pushed along this tree line. Now, if we play around on Google Earth, that was the point of view of the drone, and the destroyed tank was positioned exactly there. According to various Telegram reports, it's men of the 26th Tank Regiment of the 47th Division that repelled this Ukrainian armored counterattack. On the 27th of January, Russian troops of the 47th Division entered the hamlet of Tabaivka and knocked out Ukrainian units from the lowlands, but the defenders simply retreated to the high ground overlooking the village. The Russian assault was reported by tanks firing from a distance, like this T-80 we see near the train tracks, making sure to remain out of range of enemy FPV drones. Check out this satellite image of the landscape around Tabaivka on the 21st of January, then again on the 23rd, and look how much it changed by January 30th. We can clearly see all the work of the Russian artillery on Ukrainian defensive positions, on all this high ground overlooking Tabaivka. And that's also when rumors appeared that the Russians did actually take control of this high ground. Under this storm of steel, Ukrainian formations urgently tried to dislodge the Russians. Here you can see 2 Ukrainian APCs, the one on the right providing suppressive fire, while the M113 on the left is trying to evacuate a stranded fire team. But that being said, the Ukrainian counterattack worked, and they regained control of the high ground. The surprise of this Russian breakthrough caused a lot of panic and confusion within Ukrainian ranks. Many Telegram channels started reporting how the Russians had advanced another 1 to 2 kilometers west. In the last 24 hours, it would have been a disaster. Many Ukrainian units in that sector reading those news were considering to get the F out of there. That's when pro-Ukraine channel Deep State UA quickly intervened to rectify these communication problems. They reassured everyone of the frontline situation and made sure every unit stood its ground. To be honest, they probably avoided a complete rout. As you can imagine, if one position gives in, it could endanger all adjacent units. In the end, the front line more or less stabilized along the Tabaivka-Kotlyarivka line. I cannot say exactly how many or at what rate, but Ukrainian intelligence reported additional Russian units, including armored formations, being brought forward to Krokhmalny. From an operational perspective at this point, the big danger for the Ukrainians was not a Russian push out of Tabaivka, but a deep penetration along the H26 highway, right in the rear of the Ukrainian forces in Kislivka and Kotlyarivka. Now for the last part, we move another 60 kilometers south, between the strategic towns of Liman and Kreminna. In late January, the Russians decided to reopen this part of the front. On the 23rd, the Russians tried to push towards this forested area. We actually spoke about it in one of my previous videos. From these positions, the Russians are 600 meters away from this large forest. If they gather enough forces in this sector, they could sneak through these woods and attack Yampolivka. However, the artillery of the 63rd Mechanized Brigade pounded them good. And then tanks left the cover of the nearby forest to release their loads right into the enemy's face. They clearly noticed that this sector was heavily defended. So instead of doing like their buddies in Zinkivka, they pivoted the axis of attack and tried their luck somewhere else. Because the same day, the Russians also launched an attack 3.5 kilometers northeast. As you can see in this video, 2 Russian BMPs push forward and disembark infantry into this tree line. By looking at its geolocation, we can see the column advancing through here and the riflemen took position there. On the 25th of January, another motorized rifle assault was sent forward. In this video, the lead vehicle hit a mine, forcing the column to a stop and its crew to be evacuated by the two BMPs behind. In that same sector, it was reported that the Ukrainians lost a Leopard 2. We know this of the following footage of a Russian FPV drone strike on a tank that was already abandoned. More specifically, this is actually a Stridsvagn 122, the Swedish upgrade to the Leopard 2. A total of 10 units were sent to the Ukrainian 21st Mechanized Brigade. And magic, the 21st Mechanized Brigade is deployed near Terni, exactly where the fighting is taking place. On the 28th of January, the Russians launched a big attack. Multiple units pushed forward along this axis to support this thrust. On top of the regular artillery shelling, can you guess what the Russians did next? 3, 2, 1. That's right, Lancet and FPV drones swarming Ukrainian positions at the rear. For example, in this one, we see a self-propelled 2S1 Gvozdika also being hit by a drone. And the loss of each one of these artillery units is a big problem for Ukraine, especially if we take into account their already existing lack of artillery shells, benefiting from the fact that a lot of the enemy guns were silenced. In this video, you can see a wave of 6 Russian armored vehicles charging in open terrain and firing at a tree line occupied by Ukrainian troops. What's interesting is that we have direct and geolocated video evidence of the assault of the 28th of January, namely an attack from this direction and in this one as well. Here, a column of 4 Russian vehicles was intercepted and 2 of them got destroyed. If we take a look at the perspective of the Ukrainian drone that recorded it, the Russians advanced from this direction and probably rushed to disembark their troops in this forest. The same day, a Russian squad of 10 men was geolocated right here and targeted by an FPV drone. Strangely, although there was a big explosion, none of the soldiers were KIA and everybody got up right after, although some of them a bit stunned. During the surprise attack, not really surprise, during this follow-up attack, the Russians pushed the front 2.5 kilometers forward, capturing half this forest line nicknamed Alligator and right at the edge of Woodpecker. And by the 5th of February, the Russians expanded once more their area of control in this direction north, but mainly right here in this forest where they got a foothold. As always, we know this because of the following Ukrainian drone footage. It was geolocated right there, and it showed the destruction of multiple Russian vehicles. The Ukrainians clearly noticed that all this meant that massive Russian reinforcements were pouring inside that forest. So using a massive rocket artillery barrage, they covered the entire sector. Now if these tree lines fall to the Russians, the Ukrainians won't be able to hold Terni or Yampolivka, and this will threaten all the Ukrainian forces east of the Makivka-Nevsky line. Thankfully, the nightmare was avoided on the 7th of February, when the local Ukrainian counterattack pushed the Russians out of these woods, at least for now. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The link is in the description below.